the legendary partnership that defied every expectation and nearly destroyed itself. In 1961, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards randomly ran into each other on a train platform in Dartford, England. They had known each other as children, but life had pulled them apart. What reconnected them wasn't nostalgia, it was music. Blues records, Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, American rock and roll that barely anyone in Britain was paying attention to yet. From that moment on, they became inseparable. That friendship would build one of the most powerful partnerships in music history. Together they formed the Rolling Stones. Together they wrote songs that defined generations. For decades, the phrase Jagger-Richards became almost mythical, a songwriting alliance as iconic as Lennon-McCartney. But behind the mythology was a real relationship, and like many relationships built under pressure, fame eventually changed it. Because there was a time, not many people remember this now, when Mick Jagger and Keith Richards stopped speaking almost entirely. Not for weeks, not for months, for years. And the reason wasn't just one argument, it was success, ego, betrayal, and a partnership that slowly started pulling in opposite directions. In the early years, the Rolling Stones felt like a gang. 5 young men traveling together, sharing hotel rooms, chasing blues records, and building a reputation as the dangerous alternative to the Beatles. Mick and Keith were at the center of it all. They wrote together, lived together, sometimes even slept on the same floors after long nights of writing songs. But when the Stones exploded globally in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the dynamic began to change. Suddenly, the band wasn't just a group of musicians, it was a massive business. Touring logistics, record deals, branding, stadium shows, millions of dollars moving through the machine. And naturally, Mick and Keith started seeing their roles differently. Keith still saw the Stones as a band, a loose, chaotic rock and roll gang that existed to make music and tear up the stage. Mick started seeing something bigger, a global enterprise that needed discipline, planning, and structure to survive. Neither one was wrong, but the difference in perspective slowly created distance between them. Keith felt Mick was becoming corporate. Mick felt Keith was becoming unreliable. And when those perceptions grow inside a partnership that powerful, friction becomes inevitable. By the mid-1970s, Mick and Keith were no longer living the same life. In the early Stones years, they had shared almost everything: apartments, writing sessions, long nights building songs together. Their creative partnership thrived on proximity. But as the decade progressed, their lifestyles began drifting apart. Keith was living a far more chaotic life, touring relentlessly, surrounding himself with musicians, living inside the unpredictable rhythm of rock and roll. Mick was moving in a different direction. He was becoming more disciplined, more strategic, more aware of the band as a global brand that needed to be managed carefully. That difference started to affect their working relationship. Keith felt Mick was becoming distant, less interested in the spontaneous energy that had once fueled the band. Mick, on the other hand, began to feel that the band's future couldn't depend on chaos anymore. The Stones were too big for that. For the first time since they were teenagers, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were no longer living parallel lives. They were living separate ones, and distance has a way of weakening even the strongest partnerships. By the early 1980s, the tension between Mick and Keith was no longer subtle. For years, Keith had watched Mick evolve from the rebellious frontman of a blues band into something much bigger: a global celebrity, a businessman, a strategist for the Rolling Stones empire. And to Keith, something about that transformation didn't sit right. Keith believed the Stones were supposed to be a band first, loose, dangerous, unpredictable. But Mick increasingly approached the group like a long-term operation that needed careful management. Tours planned years ahead, contracts negotiated carefully, image controlled. To Mick, this was survival. To Keith, it felt like the band's soul was being replaced with corporate thinking. Their disagreements stopped being just creative. They became philosophical. What was the Rolling Stones supposed to be? A reckless rock band or a global institution? And once that question entered the relationship, every decision became a potential argument. By the mid-80s, the partnership that once wrote songs side by side had begun to fracture. And then Mick made a move that Keith interpreted as the ultimate betrayal. Was it really ego? Comment! In 1985, Mick Jagger made a decision that changed everything. He released a solo album. Now, on paper, that might not sound dramatic. Many band members explore projects outside their groups. It's common in rock history. But for Keith Richards, this felt different. Keith believed the Rolling Stones were supposed to come first. Always. The band had survived decades of chaos, touring, internal conflict, and industry pressure. Through all of it, the one constant had been the Jagger-Richards partnership. So when Mick began focusing on his own career, releasing She's the Boss, and talking openly about future solo work, Keith saw it as abandonment. To him, it looked like Mick was slowly stepping away from the band that had built their entire legacy. And Keith didn't hide how he felt. In interviews, he openly criticized the solo project, calling it unnecessary and questioning why Mick would divert energy away from the Stones. From Mick's perspective, the situation looked completely different. He believed the band had slowed down creatively. He wanted to explore new directions. He wanted to work at his own pace without waiting for the complicated internal dynamics of the group. To Mick, the solo work was freedom. To Keith, it was betrayal. And once those interpretations hardened, the friendship that had started on a train platform decades earlier began to freeze over. By the late 1980s, the relationship between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had reached its lowest point. They were still technically bandmates, but the friendship that once defined the Rolling Stones had almost disappeared. Communication became minimal, interviews became colder, public comments began carrying a sharp edge that fans weren't used to hearing. Keith, in particular, didn't hold back. He spoke openly about his frustration with Mick, sometimes mocking the solo career, and suggesting that Mick had lost touch with what made the Stones special in the first place. For someone who had spent decades building a creative partnership together, the criticism felt personal. Mick responded differently. Instead of escalating the conflict publicly, he focused on moving forward, recording his own material, collaborating with other musicians, and stepping further into the role of global frontman rather than bandmate. But behind the scenes, the distance was real. For several years, they barely spoke, not as friends, not as collaborators, just two men tied together by the history of the band they had built. And for a moment, it genuinely looked like the Jagger-Richards partnership might be over. What finally brought them back together wasn't a dramatic apology, it was something much simpler: time. By the late 1980s, both Mick and Keith had experienced life outside the tight structure of the Rolling Stones. Mick had explored his solo ambitions. Keith had released his own project with the Expensive Winos, proving to himself and to the world that he could step forward creatively on his own. And that changed the balance between them. For the first time in decades, neither one felt completely dependent on the other. Strangely, that independence made reconciliation easier. The pressure that once defined their partnership began to ease. When conversations about a new Stones record started circulating around 1988 and 1989, the tone was different. Less competitive, less territorial, more pragmatic. They didn't suddenly become best friends again, but they remembered something important. The Rolling Stones worked best when the two of them were in the same room. And in 1989, they proved it. The band reunited to record Steel Wheels, launching a massive world tour and restoring the partnership that many fans had assumed was permanently broken. So yeah, the relationship between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards was never simple. From the outside, people saw the swagger, the stage chemistry, the iconic songwriting credit, Jagger-Richards. But behind that name was a friendship constantly being tested by fame, pressure, and two very different personalities trying to steer the same ship. There were years when they barely spoke. Years when interviews sounded more like criticism than camaraderie. Years when it seemed like the partnership that built the Rolling Stones had finally burned out. And yet, somehow, it survived. Not because the conflicts disappeared, but because the music still worked. When they stood on stage together, the tension that once pushed them apart often became the same energy that made the band powerful in the first place. In the end, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards didn't stay together because they were always friends. They stayed together because the Rolling Stones only truly existed when both of them were there. What do you think? Comment and subscribe for more videos.